Joining us now from the Sooner State is Tom Cole, Republican congressman from Oklahoma. Congressman, how are you doing, and how do you think, more importantly, at this early phase, how do you think Donald Trump is doing so far?
Oh, we're off to an awfully good start. Look, I think he's behaved in a very presidential manner from election evening, obviously, to his public appearances with the president and with the speaker yesterday. We're pretty giddy, obviously, if you're a Republican. I think we woke up Tuesday morning thinking, gosh, it's going to be another 4 years where we're the firewall, and woke up Wednesday morning and said we're going to get a chance to be the tip of the spear. So we're pretty excited.
Tom, you got majority control of both chambers in the White House. Should President Trump, when he takes office, consult Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on legislation, or just consult you all?
No, he should actually work across the aisle where he can. Look, there are certainly some areas that we're not going to agree. We're not going to agree about the repeal of Obamacare. We're going to disagree about tax policy. But on something like infrastructure, if we can find common ground, we absolutely should.
So, for instance, on tax policy, you don't think he should take into account what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer want? That should be an all-Republican affair?
No, look, I think you listen to everybody, and if you can find common ground, you seek it and you go forward. Democrats, like Republicans, are concerned that our tax codes encouraged businesses to locate offshore. I think Democrats, like Republicans, think we've got a lot of money stranded offshore that we'd like to see come home and be invested here. So, again, I can see some areas where we can find common ground. We should do it. But we also should remember that we were given this mandate, if you will, for a reason, and not be shy about using it on things like the repeal of Obamacare, where our base feels strongly and, frankly, where Republican members have never been supportive.
Congressman, we've had some discussion in just these last 24 hours of who might fill some important posts in the administration. One of those jobs is White House Chief of Staff. Reince Priebus is a name that's been floated and kind of endorsed by Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. But we're also hearing some discussion of the possibility that Steve Bannon could be the White House Chief of Staff. What message would it send if Mr. Trump were to decide to put Steve Bannon in that job?
Well, look, first of all, I'm going to work with anybody the president-elect chooses to be his chief of staff. It's none of my business to dictate who his personnel are, and that's a choice he needs to make. It needs to be somebody he's comfortable with. Obviously, I know Reince very well, and I think he's done a spectacular job, and I'd be happy there. But there's a lot of different people that can fill that role. And, again, that's ultimately the president-elect's decision, and I think whoever he chooses, the Republican members of Congress, will be happy to work with him.
Congressman, I'm just asking you to try to answer my question there, which is what message do you think it would send if you put Steve Bannon, the guy who was the head of Breitbart News, into that job?
Not for me to interpret that. I think the most important thing for any chief of staff is that they have a strong personal relationship with the president-elect. That is uniquely his decision. So we're going to work with whoever he chooses. And, again, I'll leave that decision to the guy that won the presidency.
Let's get down in the weeds a little bit on health care. Most of my discussions with people in the health care industry is we don't love the Affordable Care Act, but we spent a lot of time adjusting to it. And if it gets repealed, we're going to have to spend a lot of time retraining, readjusting, extraordinary costs. What can your party do as you repeal it to try to get the health care sector to not be disrupted again?
Well, there's quite a few things, obviously, that the House has laid out in its Better Way agenda that the president-elect talked about in his own campaign. Things like selling insurance across state lines, associated health care plans, obviously health savings accounts, medical liability reform. But to your point, again, I think this has to be done thoughtfully. It'll probably have to be done through reconciliation. We're not going to get a lot of Democratic votes since most of them voted for Obamacare to repeal it. So we're going to have to move carefully. But I think it's a really important commitment that Republicans have made. They've made it consistently over several years. At the end of the day, it's absolutely essential that we do repeal Obamacare and we replace it with something that, in our view, works better for the American people.
Do you think there's a consensus, an actual workable consensus among Republicans on what replace would look like?
I think there is, and I think, frankly, even folks that might have questions or quibble with this or that, at the end of the day, are going to fall, in line behind what the White House requests. So we're fortunate right now to have Paul Ryan as the Speaker. He probably knows more about these kinds of policy issues than anybody else in Congress. He's not just a political tactician. He's a policy guy. So again, if the Speaker of the House comes to me and says, "I think this is the way to go," it's pretty easy for me to respect his opinion.
Congressman, people talk about infrastructure, tax reform. What else would you like to see handled early on next year in big bills?
Well, again, probably I would like to see us move ahead, and I'm not sure we will, on some entitlement reform. I don't think that was really adequately addressed in the campaign, but that's something I feel strongly about. I would like to see us make sure that sequester does not happen to the American military. I think that's absolutely critical, and I'm pleased the President-elect has basically taken that same position. And I'd like to see, long-term, that we actually do border security. I think that's something that's actually much more popular on both sides of the aisle than has been commonly recognized. Look, I don't care if you're a liberal Democrat or conservative Republican, you believe the borders of the country ought to be secure. The debate has been whether you do something comprehensive or you move pieces of legislation individually. Border security, I think we could move individually, and I think you could get significant Democratic support.
Congressman, are you confident that Paul Ryan will still be Speaker come February?
I'm absolutely confident. Boy, nothing heals wounds like victory, and I've been on any number of conference calls in the last 48 hours. There's not a whiff of opposition to any of our top 4 leaders. I think people know that we owe this Republican majority certainly to the President-elect, but also to Speaker Ryan. Nobody raised more money. Nobody worked harder. He gave us an agenda to run on. I think our members are genuinely pleased with his leadership, and I don't sense any significant challenge for him at all.
In the time between now and the President-elect takes office, there are a lot of Americans, including a lot of Republican elites, concerned about the question of whether he's ready to be commander-in-chief. What are things he could do before he took office to try to calm people who have that concern?
Well, again, not up to me to make those points or suggestions, but you made a couple of pretty good ones yourself. Look, I think when you become the president, you reach out to other people. I think the President-elect did that again when he visited the White House. I appreciate President Obama being as gracious as he was. I appreciate President-elect Trump handling it the way he did. Personally, I would go back to some of those communities that aren't historically Republican, African-American communities. I would go to a mosque. There's some things like that that I think would be, really important in a symbolic sense to try and reach out and be inclusive and reassure people. But again, I think the opening moves by the President-elect have been very, very good. So I would hope he builds on what he's done over the last 48 or 72 hours.